Welcome everyone to Wildcard Wednesday. It's April 15th, 2026, and I'm Stacy Buck, President and Senior Consultant at RadRx. So for this week, I have selected two cases for Wildcard Wednesday, and the cases were submitted also with some specific questions. So I'm also going to read the questions associated with each case before I go through them. So for this first case that we're looking at, with this report, the question was submitted: how would you code a fibrin sheath removal during a tunneled catheter exchange via the same venous access? Would you use 37799 or 36595 with modifier 52 and 59 or a different CPT code? So you can see I've already put some codes on the screen there for you based on the procedure list. The procedure list actually matches the details in the procedure report, and the rationale for assigning the 37799 actually comes from guidance that was posted in July 2023 CPT Assistant. A question was submitted back then, which said, which code should be reported when a physician performs an exchange of a tunneled hemodialysis catheter and a balloon angioplasty of fibrin sheath via the same venous access as the tunneled hemodialysis catheter on a patient? Excuse me, I have to go drink. I felt like I was about to have a coughing fit. Okay, so let me continue here. So you can see the question submitted in July 2023 CPT Assistant is similar to the question that was submitted with this case. And so the answer from CPT Assistant was that the most appropriate way to report the fibrin sheath disruption associated with the catheter exchange is with the unlisted code 37799 to represent the work of the fibrin sheath disruption in addition to the appropriate catheter exchange codes. So of course, for the catheter exchange that occurred, that's going to be 36581 for the tunneled catheter. There is no mention of fluoroscopy, the fluoroscopic guidance, the 77001 in this particular report. So I would not assign it for this case, given the lack of documentation, but know that you will also report the 77001 in addition to the 36581 when it is documented. So those are the three codes for this case. So the second case, I hope I can get through this. I've been fine all day and I go to record and now my throat is bothering me. Okay, case two. So again, I'm going to start out with the question that was submitted with this particular report. The question that was submitted is, would you code 77263, 77300 dose calculation and 77470 for this note besides embolization, catheter placement, and 79945 code? Can a provider perform it in this same session? So let's go ahead and walk through this report together. So in this first part of the report, we have a section labeled dosimetry, and it mentions the clinical treatment planning. It says that the interventional radiologist is the authorized user. So we have that question answered for us. And then there's a statement that says a review of all relevant prior imaging, angiography, the MAA results, and prior treatments was performed. And so the question is, should 77236 be based on this? Well, based on this document alone, I would not assign a 77263. Clearly, the physician is stating that it was done, but there should be documentation elsewhere in the medical record with details. And I'm going to flip over for just a moment to an example that's actually in my book, Cracking the IR Code, of what a complete 77263 would look like. So looking at this example from my book, we see that we have the detailed clinical indication. We see mention of the decision to proceed with the radiotherapy, with radioembolization, being the best option for the patient, and then sources used for treatment planning. So we see here that the physician mentions the angiographic study findings, the cross-sectional imaging that was performed, also mentions information taken from prior treatment records, the MAA scan that was performed, 3D reconstruction imaging. So you see all these different components that are included in treatment planning documented here, And then based on all of that, then the physician actually provides a treatment planning summary based on the information that was given above. So that actually is a full report with details when it comes to the 77263. So whenever you're reporting that code, you want to look for documentation that shows how each of the studies contributed to the planning of the radiotherapy, and then also the decision to opt for microsphere radiotherapy, along with the details of the treatment planning, should be thoroughly documented. And of course, this planning process typically occurs between that mapping angiogram that was performed and then the radioembolization procedure. And there's actually guidance published on that in Clinical Examples in Radiology, summer of 2015. So it's possible that 77263 was already assigned for this patient based on another document elsewhere in the medical record. So you'll want to look for the additional documentation that is required. The same is going to apply to the statement that says the volume to be treated in dosimetry was calculated on a separate 3D workstation. So the physician, and when we get further in the report, we're going to see that it mentions that the interventional radiologist did the calculation without assistance. So that would go along with code 77300. But again, this particular report doesn't have the calculation details documented in it. So I would go and I would look at additional parts of the medical record and then see where that is located and possibly whether or not it has already been reported. Because these codes that we're looking at here, anything related to planning is going to be done before, typically in almost every case, in most cases, you're going to have this type of work done on a different day than the Y90. The day that the patient is here for Y90, they've had this other work performed prior to the patient actually coming for the procedure that day. Okay, so let's look at our procedure details. So we see in our first paragraph the mention of ultrasound guidance, and we have all of our required elements there to report the 76937. Then from there, we see after the catheter was put into that right femoral artery, it gets advanced into the abdominal aorta. And so, of course, at that point, our catheter code would be 36200. But because the catheter is not going to stay in the abdominal aorta, it's going to move further, then that non-selective catheterization code is going to go away. When we go to the next paragraph there, you'll see that it says that a C2 catheter was selectively used to selectively catheterize the superior mesenteric artery, which the superior mesenteric artery would be a first order vessel 36245. And that's why the abdominal aorta catheterization code gets bundled, because we now have a selective catheterization. But when I'm reading this paragraph here, it mentions that the catheter goes into the SMA, but then in the next sentence, it mentions that the guide wire was advanced into the common hepatic. Now, the common hepatic is typically going to be off of the celiac, the same with the right hepatic and the left hepatic. Those are in the celiac family. So the fact that this mentions the SMA, at first I was like, oh, is the SMA possibly an error? But then when I look down again at the third sentence, it reiterates the superior mesenteric artery. So I'm thinking that there's some abnormal anatomy here with this particular patient. And in this report, there's not really a clear picture of that. So what I would do in this case is I would actually go back and review the mapping procedure that was performed on, whether it be, a few days before, a week before this Y90 occurs. And I would review the details of that mapping procedure to make sure that we are not missing any catheter work on this case. So the only thing I could do here was assume that this was abnormal anatomy and then treat this as if the catheter work was done in the same family, because I don't see any evidence of a catheter being pulled back and advanced into a different vascular family. So that's the big question mark over there. So I'm going on the assumption this is all done in the same vascular family and we have abnormal anatomy. But to the person who submitted this case, I recommend you go back and check the mapping procedure and then see whether or not the patient had normal or abnormal anatomy, and then determine if something in this report possibly needs to be corrected by the physician. So based on that, I followed it through from a first order to a second order. Again, possibly a second order, that right hepatic artery based on abnormal anatomy. Could be a third order, I'm not really sure. But ultimately, we end up with the catheter proximal to the segment 7 arterial branch. So that's a third order catheterization regardless. So the only catheterization code that I assigned for this case is 36247. That's the only one that I have, because again, I'm assuming it's all in the same family, and it means the lesser order catheterizations are bundled. But again, please go back and look at the mapping procedure just to make sure. Okay, so now let's look at the next portion of the procedure where the embolization is going to occur. So we see here that the TriNav pressure-enabled delivery device is being used. So depending upon which setting you're coding for is going to affect the coding. If you are coding for the professional fee, you're going to report 37243. If you are reporting for an office-based lab, you're going to report 37243. The facility setting and the hospital setting, instead of reporting the 37243, you will report C9797, which represents that embolization performed with the TriNav, and you will also report the C1982, that is for the supply of the catheter itself. So setting matters with this case. Then we see that the Y90 was administered, and then this can be coded by both the facility and it can be coded by the physician who is administering that Y90, and that's going to be 79445 for that code. Then we see mention of the pressure-enabled drug delivery advice. That's just, more commentary on using that TriNav, with that. So we can skip that past that paragraph, and then we can go down to the end of our report where we see a statement where it says radiopharmaceutical therapy by intra-arterial particulate administration. That's referring to the Y90, which we are reporting with 79445. It mentions that the radiologist is the authorized user, and the authorized user would be reported with 77790, but the AU code actually bundles with 79445 if you go and look in the NCCI manual. And then we see a statement that says dosimetry was calculated without collaboration with a radiation oncologist. Radiopharmaceutical was administered directly by the treating interventional radiologist. So again, we see mention of the dosimetry being calculated by the interventional radiologist, but we don't actually see documentation of the calculation itself. We just know that the calculation was done by the interventional radiologist. So again, I'd want to see more documentation. I'd go back and take a look, but I would feel more comfortable assigning the dosimetry code than the planning code based on this document, just as an FYI. So I'd want to see the calculation ideally somewhere, but it says that the physician did the calculation, and then we see the dose. Obviously, the planned dose is mentioned here. So that one, I'm a little bit more loose with allowing that based on the report. And then just the last comment that I added here, if we're talking about coding for the supply of the Y90, if you're in the hospital setting, you will use C2616 to report the Y90 source. And then if you are reporting for an office-based lab, you're going to report that with code Q3001. And then there's also an S code. I believe it's the S, what is it? Let me go back to my book and I can look it up for you. Back up the bus. It's the SO295. Yeah, that may be used for Blue Cross Blue Shield or maybe some other payers. So just be aware of the SO295 as well. Instead of possibly using the Q code that we just looked at, the Q3001 for the OBL, and then the C2616 for the hospital. So with these particular cases, setting matters. And then of course, obviously, if you're coding for pro fee, you're not coding for any of the supplies. So hopefully those of you who submitted these cases, you have found this helpful, particularly on this second one. There are definitely some holes in the documentation, but hopefully the analysis will help you finalize your codes on this case and then possibly go back to the physician and ask for additional information. So thank you everyone for tuning in this week, and I'll be back with more cases next week. Thank you.